Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh, our esteemed viewers to Gunjur Online TV. Welcome to another episode of our weekly environmental talk show. Today we have a very, very important guest in Dr. Famara K. Dampha. First, I apologize. We are running 30 minutes late. As you know, we live in different parts of the world, so there is always sometimes confusion about the time scheduling. We sincerely apologize, but I hope those who were present to sit here and wait for Famara to present will not be disappointed. Famara is one of the brightest young Gambians who is currently based in the US, and he agreed to come here and discuss his latest assignment with UK Department of for International Development. Um, but I will leave this farmer to actually introduce herself in Mandinka Chokoreka Diawolo Fongole Dakon. Farmer, welcome to Bunyo TV Online. And please introduce yourself to our viewers. Who is Farmer NK Dampha? And be generous to yourself because Gambians, generally, we are not good at selling ourselves. And this is a good opportunity for you to tell Gambians who is Farmer NK Dampha. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Mr. Manjang. It's always a pleasure to be on your show, Gunjur Online. As you said, I am Famara Dampha. I am a Gambian. I am currently a young fellow working with the World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center on forced displacement, which is headquartered in Copenhagen, Denmark. I will tell you more about this center because that is essentially where I'm working. But I'm also the founding executive director for the Household Disaster Resilience Project, commonly known as Help Gambia, which is a Gambian-based nonprofit organization with the mission of strengthening households' resilient and adaptive capacity, and also reducing their risk and vulnerabilities to climate-induced hazards, including extreme weather events. I recently hold a PhD in climate change policy and natural resource economics, and a master's degree in international development practice, both from the University of Minnesota. I also got my BA in development studies from our own University of the Gambia. So my professional and research interest areas really focus on international development theory and practice, global migration studies, natural resource economics, climate change policy, disaster risk reduction, and really also the application of GIS-based remote sensing applications in some of these topic areas. And the geographic area of my interest is in developing countries, Africa, Asia, and Latin American countries. So in terms of my professional work experience, I used to work with the Gambia government, started with the Personal Management Office, and then was moved to the Ministry of Fisheries and Water Resources, and later to the National Disaster Management Agency, where I was the Director of Administration shortly before I left for my graduate studies here in the United States. So that's all I will say for today. Thank you, Mr. Manja.
Yeah, thank you very much, Farmer. That's a very, very impressive resume for somebody so young. Farmer, recently you've been awarded the UK Department for International Development, that is DFID, World Bank, UNHCR Young Fellowship Programs on building the evidence on protracted forced displacement. Placed at World Bank, UNHCR Joint Data Center, JDC in Copenhagen, Denmark. Tell us more about this, following a briefly described the role of the World Bank in international development and also humanitarian affairs. I hope I managed to put that question fairly good, and I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
It's a very good question. And as we know that forced displacement, and others will call it distressed migration, which I will define a little more later on. As these crises arise, we consider them as grand challenges. They are wicked and complex development challenges. So a new multi-partnership fellowship program on forced displacement was recently launched through a joint effort by the UK Department for International Development and the World Bank Group. and also with the United Nations Agency for Refugees, commonly known as the UNHCR. This fellowship has been recruiting young scholars from low and middle income countries to conduct innovative analysis on topics related to forced displacement. And of course, the selection process for such a fellowship was really competitive. Out of 100 of applications, 14 of us from 12 different countries in Africa and in Asia, currently working with these partner institutions to collect data, build evidence, and to inform country-specific policy decisions. And I believe that all of us are postdoctoral scholars. I must say that I'm honored and humbled to be among those awarded, and really super excited to be working with the newly created World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, which occasionally, as we talk, I would refer to as the JDC. But I would like to say, Mr. Manjang, as a disclaimer, as a newly appointed JDC fellow, I take responsibility of my statements. My statements represent my views, and any potential error here is mine, not that of the JDC. And some of my deliberations are all will be broad and will not necessarily relate to the work program of the JDC. Some of it will, but some will not. So for more specific JDC-related work activities, I refer our viewers to the Joint Data Center website. I would like to say that. So, however, I also know that the JDC, which is the Joint Data Center, is working on improving data quality and data access on forced displacement. This is because there is currently scarcity of data, particularly anonymized microdata on forcibly displaced persons and their host communities. So host community here, we're referring to places where refugees, IDPs, and other affected people are residing. So I will refer to the word, when I say host community, that's the population or the group, the area that I'm referring to more specifically. Now, through this fellowship program and as part of the JDC's mandate, it is working with young researchers like us, coming from, in some cases, affected countries that are actually dealing with this crisis, to build our capacity, but also to facilitate our work and forge partnerships to strengthen the evidence on forced displacement. And you talk about the role of the World Bank. As we know, the World Bank is a multilateral institution that is working on a range of development challenges, grand challenges, including but not limited to healthcare issues, education, infrastructure, climate change issues, and agricultural development issues. Now, the World Bank has these twin goals, that is to end poverty and enhance shared prosperity by 2030. And it's important to say that extreme poverty, it's becoming more and more entrenched in places we call fragile and conflict-affected states. And a recent World Bank report estimates that by 2030, 2/3 of those extremely poor will be living in countries affected by fragility, conflict, violence, if no action and immediate action is taken right now to address some of these challenges. And that is why addressing fragility is a strategic priority for the World Bank, and forced displacement is a key component of that strategic direction. And I would like to say also in 2016, the World Bank announces the Global Concessional Financing Facility to support development on concessional terms for low and middle income countries who are impacted by refugee crises. And these are loans with low interest rate, helping countries to actually address some of these challenges. So I'll stop there on that question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nfamara. That is very, very impressive. But coincidentally, today is World Statistic Day. World Statistic Day. Could you briefly share with our audience the importance of this day as it relates to the work of the World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement?
Thank you, Mr. Manneh, once again. So yes, today is the World Statistics Day. This is an international day to celebrate statistics, right? And the theme for this year's celebration is actually connecting the world with data we can trust. And that is really important. As we deal with humanitarian questions, humanitarian issues, it's really important to talk about data protection, so data that we can trust. And this day was declared by the United Nations Statistics Division 10 years ago. And the day, I believe, is celebrated every 5 years. But since 2010, over 100 countries have celebrated what they call National Statistics Day, including 51 African countries that celebrate what they consider as the African Statistics Day annually on 18th of November every year. And when this day was launched on the first World Statistics Day, the former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon encouraged the international community to work with the United Nations to enable countries to meet their statistical needs. Now, statistical needs relates to what issues around data collection, data organization, data analysis, data interpretation, and data presentation. So these are issues that countries are actually working on to improve evidence on various issues of national interest. And as the old saying goes, you can only manage what you can measure. So it's important that we recognize the importance of data and evidence in order to inform and drive policy decisions. And data deprivation, as we speak, affects 70% of people in fragile and conflict-affected states. And this represents a major barrier to understanding and addressing their welfare needs. Now, a recent study by Coral and others in 2020, stated that over 500 million people live in fragile and conflict-affected economies or states with no or outdated poverty data. Now, the JDC's work in relation to the World Statistics Day is super important because, as you know, the JDC is about data, it's about evidence, it's about informing decision makers. Now, as I said, the JDC is building the requisite capacity to leverage the use of latest data collection and data analytics tools to fill the data gaps, but also to strengthen the data systems and enhance data innovation, improve data access, and promote knowledge sharing. And this is also in the same way that it helps to promote data digitalization and visualization for informing policy decisions across the world, and especially in places where forcibly displaced populations are residing. In the work of the JDC, it is really important to say that they focus a lot on country-level outcomes and impacts. However, the JDC also work with a range of stakeholders, partners to strengthen national and international data systems and data standards. So that is how I would say today, the significance of this day, it's really all about what the JDC is out to do and it is doing. It's about evidence, it's about data, it's about informing policy, especially policy related to forcibly displaced populations and the host communities they are residing in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Farmer. We consider all that part of the introduction, which brings us to the actual main topic, which is forced displacement, a humanitarian and development crisis. But Farmer, what is forced displacement? If you will explain this to our viewers, what is forced displacement, and what are the main causes of forced displacement?
Thank you. So when we say forced displacement, the other word or term for it would be forced migration. And that goes to the issue of migration. And migration comes in different shapes and forms. You can think of migration as voluntary migration or forced migration or distress migration, right? And migration also occurs internally or internationally. Now, forced displacement or migration occurs when an individual, but in most cases, when a group of people are subjected to involuntarily leave their place of residence due to some form of conflict, violence, a human rights violation, or high level of insecurity in places where they are residing. Now, broadly speaking, we can say that forced displacement and migration can also be influenced by climate, environmental, and other types of disasters. And if you look at the category of people included in this population, that is a forcibly displaced population, it includes internally displaced persons. We call them IDPs. So these are people who are displaced within the boundaries of their own sovereign nations, right? We also have refugees, and there's a specific UNHCR definition on who is considered to be a refugee. Refugees are usually people who flee their home country and now residing in other countries. We also have asylum seekers who are considered to be, in some cases, part of this population of forcibly displaced people. And the UNHCR and the World Bank also considers returnees and stateless people to be part of this group of people considered to be forcibly displaced. When you look at stateless people, for example, which is a term, the very legally defined term, it's a person who is not considered as a national by any state under the operations of that state. So there are people actually today who reside in other places and nobody considers them as nationals of their state in terms of the operations of the laws of those countries. So that is what I would say is the main causes of forced displacement that the UNHCR is looking at is really about displacement due to conflict, violence, prostitution, human rights violations, and insecurity of many kinds. Displacement due to environmental factors. This is a gray area that there's a lot of research on, I would say, but it's not really the focus of the statistics that we'll be talking about today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that in-depth explanation. Our next question is how and why is this a humanitarian crisis?
That's a very good question, Mr. Manja. It is a humanitarian crisis because 1% of the world's population is displaced. I mean, literally 1% of humanity is uprooted from places they consider to be as their home. You know, globally today, an estimated 79.5 million people have fled their homes due to some form of conflict, violence, or fear of persecution. Right? If you break this number down, this is we're talking about 45.7 million people considered to be internally displaced persons. These are IDPs globally, 45.7 million people. We have 26 million people globally that are considered to be refugees and 4.2 million people who are asylum seekers. And this is based on the 2019 update on this population from the UNHCR data. These numbers have been increasing largely because of the continued rise in the prevalence of fragile and conflict-affected situations globally. And two-thirds or more than two-thirds of the forcibly displaced populations come from only 6 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, Venezuela, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. And half of this population is considered to be children. So this is a serious problem we're looking at. Right? And the hardship that this population endure due to their displacement makes them extremely vulnerable and exposed to all kinds of hazards. In many cases, they have lost their homes, their assets, livelihood options. Some of them lost their family members, and their future is considered to be uncertain. You know, they suffer from all kinds of problems, including emotional and psychological trauma. Some of them have issues around post-traumatic stress disorder. They are also exposed to high risk of gender-based violence in some cases. They suffer from discrimination, marginalization, exploitation, and in some cases, in some places, they're not even allowed to work. Their freedom of movement is restricted. So this is a problem that we are looking at. And even under the face of the recent COVID-19, this population seems to be more vulnerable than the host communities they're living in. So this is essentially, it is a humanitarian crisis, and we need collective action, actually. Action from the international organizations, but we also need intensified national action to address these challenges. And I think that's important that we think about the problem as a complex, but a multi-stakeholder approach is what we need to address some of these humanitarian issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Farmer. You quote some startling numbers there. You know, the number of people who are displaced and also the number of people who are considered refugees. I think the world should be more compassionate about this group of people. But Farmer, how is this? Is this a developmental issue when you have this number of people moving around and also refugees? Will you consider this a developmental issue?
That's a fantastic question. If I may, I would quote the head of the JDC, Bjorn Gilsarter, who said, "Forced displacement is a complex development challenge as much as it is a humanitarian one." And on why these two is connected, because think of it, the data shows that over 80%, some talk about 85% of the forcibly displaced population are hosted by low and middle income countries. Let's take a moment to absorb that information. Over 85% of this population are hosted by low and middle income countries. These are countries that are struggling to meet their own development challenges, their own development needs, right? So think of accommodating a mass influx of people. These present challenges to the host governments and also put pressures on them to deliver basic human services, basic infrastructural services, not just for their citizens, but also for the forcibly displaced people. But it's also important to acknowledge that forced displacement also come with some opportunities for the host communities or the host countries. So there are cases where they come with skills that benefit the local communities in which they are residing in. Now, if I give you some of the estimates in terms of countries hosting this population, in Bangladesh, for example, we have more than 1 million Rohingya refugees who were forcibly displaced from Myanmar, due to violence and conflict. And in Uganda, also, we have over 1 million refugees from South Sudan, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Burundi, and from Somalia. So if you look at these numbers, about 77% of these refugees are considered to be in a protracted situation. In other words, they live in these countries for more than 5 years. Now, for us development practitioners, we measure development and measure economic well-being, the development of any nation, by actually asking some fundamental questions. We look at issues: what's happening to poverty, what's happening to inequality, what's happening to unemployment. These are all economic-based indicators, right? But development goes beyond economics. Development is also about human capital development, the capabilities approach, the ability for individuals to function as people, to build, acquire knowledge and contribute to societal development. That's very fundamental. And this population is often left aside when it comes to human capital development. But recently, we are also seeing a lot of effort, a lot of research on the fundamental component of natural capital. In other words, nature's contribution to improving the welfare, the well-being of all communities. So this is important. So when we look at extreme poverty, for example, globally since 2000, I would say, we have seen a decline in extreme poverty rates in many countries. But this is not necessarily the case for countries that are considered to be fragile and conflict-affected states. In many of these fragile and conflict-affected states, poverty rates, according to some studies, are actually increasing or stagnating, or at best, they are declining very slowly. So, the United Nations has what they call the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the famous SDGs. Now, think of it. We cannot achieve the SDGs, for example, the goal number 1, which is about ending poverty, goal number 2, which is about zero hunger, and goal number 10, which is about reducing inequality. These goals cannot be achieved if we don't intensify our actions in terms of collecting the evidence on the realities of situations on the ground. And this is the evidence that we use to inform policy, to make the right policy decisions that can improve the well-being and the welfare of our people, right, including the forcibly displaced populations. When you look at another indicator, economic indicator, which is unemployment, and I would add inequality rates to that, these two indicators seem to be higher in many of these countries that are considered to be fragile and conflict-affected states, most of them with a large number of refugees and IDPs relative to other countries. So there is that inequality in the development discourse here. We're looking at fragility, we're looking at conflict, we're looking at states where this population is hosted, we see these differences. Access to education is important, like I said, right? Education in these situations, access particularly is difficult. In some cases, very problematic for the forcibly displaced populations to even access education, to go to school, to go to universities and stuff like that. In some communities, they are not allowed. But in as much as education is important, we know from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's about what? It's about basic needs. It's about shelter, it's about food, it's about water. Those are fundamental. So if we don't have adequate supply of those resources, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to ponder about, thinking about acquiring knowledge or building human capital for personal and for societal needs. But the final component of this, which I would say is the natural capital component. I would state here, in my view, personally, that natural capital is the fundamental bedrock of any development. That is my view, because majority of people in developing countries, I want to emphasize that the majority of people in developing countries, including countries that are hosting the forcibly displaced population, depend on natural and environmental resources for their lives and livelihoods demands. They depend on food, they depend on land, they get shelter materials from the environment, their domestic energy sources come from the environment, and they depend on the environment for meeting their daily water demands. This is evident on the ground, especially in places where forcibly displaced people are residing. However, we know that in as much as nature is contributing to improving their well-being, we know there is growing evidence on the scarce availability and increasing overexploitation and depletion of natural resources. And we cannot ignore that. Since nature is the fundamental bedrock for any development, we have to look at it. Policymakers need to understand these issues. For example, if you look at lack of access to water resources or water systems, not just for farming, but in some cases, even for drinking, is a complicated or complex problem in some countries. In some parts of Somalia, in South Sudan, the access to water is a problem, and this makes life and livelihood needs extremely difficult to attain. Imagine going for a day or half of a day without access to food, access to water. These are really complicated problems that has health implications. So considering all of these challenges, Mr. Manjang, you would agree that clearly the forced displacement we're talking about here, it's not just a humanitarian crisis, it's a development crisis. In development, like I said, the simplest and the basic definition of development is to improve the welfare and the standard of living of a people. But we can't do that without actually look at all the capitals that contribute to that enhancement of human development and personal economic development of all kinds. So recently, under the Global Compact on Refugees, this is now internationally recognized. That is the Humanitarian Development Nexus, that the development and humanitarian agencies are now aligning efforts to respond to crisis together. That is not just about the UNHCR responding to the situation, but it's about the World Bank, which has a development mandate to also work with the UNHCR. And the Joint Data Center, I would say, is a perfect example of putting that into practice. And a lot of other international organizations are now realizing that humanitarian issues are development issues, and we cannot treat them exclusively. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Famara. This is an interesting topic. Since you mentioned the JDCs, I'm going to ask you, can you describe what JDC's foundation is and its mandates, and give example of JDC's country-specific projects to the viewers of Gunjur TV online TV?
Thank you once again. Like I said, when you think of the Joint Data Center, think of data and evidence and policy. It's about data, it's about data collection, it's about data analysis, it's also about data dissemination, data sharing. But data that is anonymized, in other words, data that is not identifiable. So microdata on demographic information, on socioeconomic information, like data on skills of the refugees, their income levels, their health status, education level, and economic activities. This is the data that is critical for any population. Now, for country level JDC activities, the JDC is now working with national statistical offices to include forcibly displaced populations in national surveys. And you may know that traditionally, household surveys often exclude refugees and other affected populations due to, in some cases, lack of access, but also sometimes other associated risk elements. So the JDC, as a practical example, is working in Ethiopia, in the Central African Republic, where they are conducting household surveys, which include the refugee population and the IDP population. In the Democratic Republic of Congo also, the JDC is setting up crisis observatory system, and in Bangladesh, it's also supporting a locally owned statistics center. So these are activities that the JDC look at. But in terms of the scope of the JDC, it's important to emphasize that the JDC is not just about data on refugees, the IDPs, and stateless people, but also about data and evidence on returnees, people who return home from after being displaced, right? They also look at evidence and data on asylum seekers in the countries where they are residing. But more importantly, again, from the development angle, the JDC focuses a lot of attention on the host community. And that's important to acknowledge because it's not just about the people who are coming, but we also have to look at the welfare of the people who are currently in these communities. We cannot just focus on one and leave the other, so it's important that we bring the two groups together. And that is a fantastic model. It is the humanitarian and development nexus model, I would say. It's a perfect model that is working on the ground. Country-specific activities, the World Bank and the UNHCR, you see them work together, and I think that is phenomenal. I think we need to encourage things of that nature as we look at these complex issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nfamara. The next question is, what specific project will you be involved in? What's this project entails? Can you explain to the viewers of Gunjur Online TV, the specific project you will be involved in?
So as a first project, I am currently working. So I am supporting data analysis of a JDC supported data collection activity on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on refugees and host communities in 6 countries. So currently I am working on the data for Ethiopia, but we are also doing work in Chad, in Djibouti, in Jordan, in Iraq, and in Niger. So the data is collected through what is considered as a high frequency phone survey. So this is a phone-based interview implemented by countries with the support of the World Bank country team. So they call respondents, respondents using a cell phone just because of the risk of the COVID-19. And we all know that the pandemic has affected the lives and livelihoods of people, millions of people globally. And there is definitely reason to believe that the most vulnerable populations may be the most affected, but without evidence, without data, without analytics, we cannot actually substantiate these claims, right? So it is difficult to understand, like I said, the gravity of some of these challenges without doing data analysis or collecting the data in the first place. So to come up with countermeasures in terms of alleviating the suffering that people are going through, including forcibly displaced, it's important that we do these surveys. That's really important. But if you look at the population of interest here, that's a forcibly displaced population, there are fragile livelihood conditions, and often the overcrowded and poor living condition in which they live make them more susceptible to health and economic shocks, because of this pandemic. So, and there is really scarcity of data in this area, and which is a problem. And for governments to respond to the crisis, it's important that we get in timely data to address some of the challenges that they might be going through. So I think that's important to reduce their vulnerability, but also to enhance this World Bank objective of improving shared prosperity for everybody, not just citizens, but also people who are displaced. So that is the country-specific project that I'm working on at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Farah. Sorry, I was muted. Famara, this will be my final question on this. Since the fellowship is research related, what will your research focus on, and why is that important?
That is a thank you for ending the interview with that question, because that's a fantastic question. So my research will focus on how natural capital, which is environmental resources and the services that they generate for improving human well-being, we call them ecosystem services. And the recent term that we use is nature's contribution to improving human well-being. So I've been looking at how these services improve the well-being and the welfare of the forcibly displaced people, right? But I also look at how forced displacement affect the natural capital, natural resources of the host communities. That's why it's important that we understand that humanity has relied on natural capital for survival demands for many centuries. So it's about how is nature benefiting people. It should not always about how are people affecting nature. That is important. So both directions are important here, but we have to know and to assess the trade-off. There's a trade-off there. We have to look at, which makes sense for us to do. Can we save a million lives by providing them some sort of natural capital resources that they can depend on? Or should we leave them to perish and say we don't have the space for them? So the questions around land availability, water availability, access to certain resources, marine resources, forest resources that people need. These are all important issues that contribute to well-being and welfare. And I would like to say that it's important to be emphasized that reducing poverty and enhancing shared prosperity, which are these twin objectives of the World Bank, they go beyond economic, it goes beyond social issues. It is also beyond human development issues. Many scholars today agree that the appropriate method to measuring the well-being of any given society is to use what we call an inclusive or a comprehensive wealth approach. This is fantastic. Now, what that means is an inclusive approach attempts as much as possible to include measures of financial capital, measures of human capital, measures of manufactured capital, social capital, but more importantly, also natural capital. And in developing world, in the developing countries, let's realize that these countries depend a lot on natural capital assets and flows for sustaining their lives. They don't seem to have a lot of financial capital. They don't seem to have, we are developing a human capital, but manufactured capital, we don't seem to have resilient manufactured products and capital. We have a very good social capital, I would say. So we have to leverage the use of these capitals, in other words, right, to improve the well-being of our people. So again, it's about how do we depend on the land? How do refugees depend on the land? And how are they provided with land in the first place? In some places, refugees are just, they are stuck in a place where they don't even have space to live. Countries, in some places, countries are like they're not welcoming them to their territories. So access to land, in as much as simple as it may be, it's so fundamental for a group of people who are displaced. Access to water, access to forests and marine ecosystems are essential for survival needs. So I would conclude by saying that investigating this nexus between hosting and the use of natural resources will make policymakers to introduce the appropriate actions for balancing the sustainable use of those resources, not just for the benefit of the refugees, but also for the benefit of the host population or the host community. And that would be my work. And I cannot, again, emphasize the importance of looking at the contribution of nature to improving the welfare of a population that is very vulnerable to many different types of hazards. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Famara. That's an impressive presentation. And Gunyu Online TV would like to congratulate you for this wonderful opportunity. And also, we will want to follow your progress as it goes. And if you need to talk to Gambians to communicate, our doors are open for you. You can, we consider as one of our team members anyway, because we are trying to build this platform so it can be the voice for the voiceless, and also a platform where Gambian intellectuals can communicate, can link the youth or general population of the Gambians. So we are grateful for your valuable time to come here and discuss this important work. I said that was the last question, but I want you to clarify one thing, because when you talk about forced displacement, you mentioned mainly it's about wars, the disabilities in all parts of the world. But when you come to natural disasters, like in the Gambia, you go to the Nema Concourse, another part of the world, people have been displaced. Will you consider this as forced displacement or just?
This is thank you. This is a very good question, and this question is coming up
Yeah.
every time you talk about forced displacement, whether you're talking with policymakers or with academics. It's coming up. Forced displacement goes beyond violence and conflict and persecution and all of that. It's about environment. It's about displacement due to climate change factors. This is an area that I'm super excited about. Right, I'm very much interested in research work in that area. Right. So it's about issues around drought. People are being displaced. So here you are talking about the root causes of displacement, right? It's not just again about violence and conflict, but it's about the environmental debilitations, exploitations, in some cases, lack of environmental needs that people need for survival. If people don't have water, they will leave. If they don't have food, there's drought, their animals are dying, there is famine all the time, they will leave to places where they can rely on the land for productive purpose. If people in coastal areas are displaced or inundated on annual basis because of climate change issues like sea level rise, there will be problems. These are all related problems of displacement. And there is evidence, there's growing evidence on the area of displacement due to climate and environment. And I can tell you, it's going to be very soon a very central piece of this question. But to be clear, the JDC at the moment is looking very closely at violence and conflict. Right? I just want to make that clear. They're looking at that direction. But it is not to say that they wouldn't be looking at environmental and climate-induced disasters. These are issues that will come up. But based on the current work program they have, we're looking at the host communities and the impact of displacement on the host community, and impacts on the refugees, but also on the host community. But going back to the root causes of displacement, we have to, for a more sustainable way, especially when you think of return migration, if people are going to return to where they come from, we need to make sure that the land, there are adaptation mechanisms or strategies in which they can use to address some of these challenges. So evidently, there is a problem of environment and climate-induced migration. Thank you. Looks like we lost.
Sorry about that. Gambia, right? Yeah, for some reason the internet just went in because I have a mobile router, but for some reason it just went off. I think that will be a good place to to conclude, so it won't happen again. But I keep my fingers crossed. Maybe I forget to uncross them, so things went off. But we are grateful. And also, Farmer, if you have anything to write, sometimes it's not always easy to come and sit 1 hour or so. But if you have something to write for publication, we also publish articles. But it's important, people with your level of education and understanding to continue to communicate, because our country is going through traumatic times. And it's people like you who can accuse lead us, to probably the so-called promised land. And it's there. It's just happened that the Gambia intellectuals, most of the time feel probably too good to get involved in the hustle and bustle of politics. And that's what gives the platform, the room for the like of the Hamad Bas, they are jam seekers. These are kind of people taking the space and they are making it more and more modier. These countries deserve better because you look at any facet of international state Gambians are occupying, you are the latest addition to that. But you come back home, situations are terrible. So this is a platform that we can try to change the narrative. The way things are is not, to be honest, is not pretty. So once again, thank you, our viewers. Also, thank you very much. We apologize. We were about half an hour late. That's due to some technical errors and technical issues. Um, but we value your time, and Pamela, thank you. And if you have any final words, please feel free to conclude to close this program.
I would say that the question we are looking at today, it's not just about East Africa, it's also about West Africa. And today I didn't give you much information about what's happening in West Africa. We have countries like Chad, we have countries like Niger, we have places that are affected. Even in the Gambia, we have a refugee population. So, we have to, as people, think as global citizens, right? Um, just imagine what this population goes through. There is evidence that peace is something to celebrate, and to maintain peace and stability, it's important. The Gambia is a peace-loving country. I would encourage all Gambians to just maintain peace and avoid anything that will trigger any form of domestic, social, or tribal violence. And particularly that the elections are coming next year, and these elections will be very tense. Let's maintain peace. And the numbers I give you are just examples to say that there are people who are looking for home, they can't get home. There are people who want to go home, they can't go home. So if we have a peaceful country like the Gambia, there is nothing else we can cherish more than that. We go through political rhetorics in various ways and forms, but let's just remember at the end of the day, peace and unity is what we need in the Gambia. And we should all be there to promote that. And our political behavior, unfortunately, young people particularly, we should be careful and not to listen to politicians all the time, because at the end of the day, we have issues. These politicians going back to interact, and they leave us quarreling, leave us not even talking to each other. In some communities, people don't even talk to each other just because of politics. And I think that this year it should be different. We should bring the politicians to task. We should have those political debates, presidential debates, and let them talk to Gambians about policy. And let's just avoid these politics about, politics of association to a particular group just because your father was in that group, or just because there's a tribal affiliation. Those are things that we should do away. And I think the Gambian youth is developing that critical mind and understanding of those questions and issues. So I would say, Mr. Manjan, thank you very much once again, and then let's keep the conversation. Thank you. I'm honored to be here, and thank you to the viewers for watching us.
Yeah, thank you very much. We are grateful. Thank you. Baraka.
Baraka. Thank you.